The text arrived between the soft chime of my boutique's front door and the rustle of tissue paper around a silk scarf. I remember the exact feel of the satin ribbon against my fingers when my phone lit up with a message that split my life in two. He was leaving me. He was moving to Miami with a girl barely old enough to rent a car, and he'd emptied our joint account. His parting joke punctuated with a small, cruel laugh typed in lowercase. I didn't gasp. I didn't drop the scarf. I smiled at Mrs. Peterson and asked if she preferred silver or white ribbon, because sometimes composure is the only armor you can reach for in public. When she left, I tied the door sign to closed, breathed in the scent of cedar hangers and new leather, and texted back 2 words that tasted like steel on my tongue. Good luck. I'm Claire, 38. I own a little boutique that people like to call charming, though there was nothing charming about the way my husband chose to set our marriage on fire. What he couldn't see, what men like him never seem to see, is how long a woman can live with a hairline crack before the whole surface reshapes itself into something stronger. For months I'd watched the tells, the gym clothes tight across a softening midsection, new cologne meant to erase time, sudden passwords, late nights that didn't align with his bank deposits. The story was writing itself in tiny ledgers, and being my grandmother's granddaughter, I kept careful books. I opened an account in my name at a different bank. I shifted my personal savings like pieces on a chessboard. I cataloged receipts that smelled like truffle pasta and hotel bleach. When he imagined me begging, I was busy color-coding a binder. That's a thing I learned in the house where I grew up, the same house I inherited from Gran, the one Mark always wanted on the deed for simplicity. Gran didn't believe in drama when a ledger would do. She taught me to boil grief down to statements and totals, to let numbers say the things our throats couldn't carry. She'd press my hand to her pulse and whisper, "Count Claire." There's order, even when the heart feels chaotic. After she died, I put her ledger book on my nightstand. When Mark's second text arrived, "Don't bother begging, we leave tomorrow," I slid her old fountain pen under the elastic and drew a neat line under the date. I called my lawyer, the one I'd quietly met for coffee 2 months earlier, while pretending to source new handbags. She didn't ask if I was sure. She already knew. We spoke like women discussing weather we'd both felt on our skin. "It's time," I said, and the way the words left me calm, round definitive, felt like breathing after being underwater too long. She told me the papers were ready. I told her not to rush serving him, that a man who announces his exit with a ha-ha deserves the mercy of not understanding how completely he's already lost. At home, the sunlight made a gold square on the hardwood where Gran's rug used to be, and dust turned in it like lazy galaxies. I pulled down the wedding album, ran my finger over our frozen smiles. He looked young there. So did I. I waited for the ache to rise, the sudden buckling, but it came as a thin, clean sadness instead, like rain on a day you'd planned to water the garden anyway. My phone buzzed with more messages, some sharp enough to cut, others dressed as pity. He told me I was getting older. He told me I'd be fine with my little shop. I screen-captured every word, slid each into a folder named Evidence, with the same care I used to tuck silk camisoles into tissue. Let him narrate. I would simply keep the record. When he bragged that he'd used our joint card for first-class tickets and a hotel with a view of water he didn't deserve, I made tea and phoned the credit card company. There is a particular steadiness that arrives when you refuse to be humiliated. My voice held it as I explained that the charges were unauthorized. The woman on the other end listened the way nurses listen to women who walk into ERs at 3 in the morning, all bones and resolve. We canceled the trip, and the room with a few clean keystrokes, a tiny justice that made me want to laugh for the first time that day. Somewhere a reservation would be floating in a hotel's system, a beautiful empty room waiting for people who would never arrive. That night I poured the good Cabernet I'd been saving for one day and laid out documents on the dining table and corporation papers for the boutique in my name, the house deed that had never carried his bank statements, screenshots, a thin stack of hotel receipts that smelled faintly like someone else's perfume. I thought of Gran again, of the way she used to say that grief like vinegar preserves. I realized how much of myself I had preserved over the years, quietly, carefully, while Mark mistook my stillness for emptiness. I was not empty. I was a room full of light, with the shades pulled down, waiting for the right hour to open. By morning, his texts had turned from taunts to demands the way thunder sometimes softens into pleading rain. He wanted answers about flights and hotels, about cards that no longer worked. I silenced the phone and drove to the boutique where a shipment of handbags waited like small, practical miracles. As I lifted each, I thought about the women who would carry them, what they'd tuck inside: lip balm, invoices, pacifiers, divorce decrees, and I felt a fierce tenderness for all of us. A city of women crossing streets with our lives in our hands. Around noon, his mother called the shop. She used my name like a bandage and his like an apology. She told me the story he'd fed them, how I was cold and controlling, how I had driven him away. I stood at the window display and watched my reflection hold steady, while my heart shook once and then rerouted. I offered her the truth gently, a fingertip lifting a veil, told her I could read her the messages where he admitted the things he was now denying, but that my lawyer had advised distance. We hung up with the kind of politeness that stings the tongue. Afterward, I wrapped a dress for a young woman buying something brave for a new job, and thought, yes, that's the right phrase. Something brave. When the afternoon turned to the soft, forgiving light that makes even empty rooms look hopeful, my attorney called with a court date. An emergency hearing, she said, and I heard the quiet satisfaction in her voice, a note of solidarity that hummed down the line and steadied me. I looked around my life, the neat rows of dresses, the neat rows of facts, and felt a clarity that didn't ask permission. If revenge is a flame, mine was blue and controlled, the kind that can cut through steel. I wasn't chasing him. I wasn't even punishing him. I was simply refusing to carry what he'd tried to lay at my feet. The emergency hearing unfolded in a room that smelled like paper and rain, the kind of place where truths are measured in exhibits and stamped with dates. I sat beside my attorney and watched the second hand circle a cheap wall clock, while the clerk called our names, and I marveled at how ordinary the world can look on the day it changes you. Mark arrived late, his jaw set the shine of a man who believes rules are suggestions dulled slightly by the absence of sleep. He scanned the room as if he might find the exit he'd planned on the one with ocean views and a woman who spoke in emojis. When the judge asked about the withdrawals, my lawyer slid the bank statements forward with the calm of a woman setting down a teacup. The numbers did all the shouting. I didn't look at him until she read his text aloud, the lowercase laugh at the end, like a cheap bow tied around cruelty, and then I let my eyes meet his and hold. It wasn't triumph. It was accounting. A ledger balancing. The judge's voice had the texture of cloth that has been washed 100 times. She spoke about marital assets and temporary restraining orders, and how in the absence of consent, sudden transfers look a lot like theft. She granted the freeze, signed the injunction, and told him to return what he had moved. I could feel Mark's anger rise like heat from asphalt, but it had nowhere to go. It burned up under fluorescent lights and landed back on his own skin. Outside the courtroom, he hissed something that used to make me flinch. Something about how I'd be sorry, how my little shop would fold without him. But I only thought of Gran's fountain pen drawing its neat lines, and of how even now there was order hidden inside the chaos he thought he'd created. In the quiet, after I drove home with the radio off. A storm had rinsed the city clean, and the world looked like it had been given a second try. I put the court folder on Gran's old secretary desk and opened her ledger to a page I didn't remember. There, tucked under the corner like a pressed leaf, was an envelope addressed in her tidy hand. For when a man mistakes your silence for surrender. Inside, she had left me 2 things: a brass key taped to an index card with a bank's name I recognized from childhood, and a note that said simply, "Count on yourself, Claire." I ran my thumb over the indents of her letters and felt a warmth move through me that no court order could give. It wasn't the money I imagined the key might unlock. It was the legacy of a woman who had understood that love and protection can share a body, that tenderness can wear armor. The next day at the boutique, the light fell through the front windows in clean rectangles, and I thought about how many mornings I had arranged dresses to sit inside those bright shapes, like women stepping into their own definitions. He came in before noon, bringing the smell of wet pavement and aftershave that tried too hard. The bell above the door chimed its gentle note, and for a breath, I considered letting him be just another customer. But rage has a way of arriving in a well-tailored suit. It thinks it belongs everywhere. He leaned across the counter and spoke in the low tone men use when they want the world to think everything is fine. He told me I had humiliated him, that I was ungrateful, that I was ruining more than a marriage. He said the word boutique like it was a hobby rather than a business that paid mortgages and salaries, as if I had knit it out of whim instead of building it with receipts and holidays worked and backaches from inventory nights. I let him talk until his words turned into vapor. Then I told him what the judge had signed, how the bank would be expecting him, how numbers have a way of finding their way home. He flashed the smile he used to charm vendors into forgiving late payments, and that was when he made a mistake. He couldn't unmake. He said there was a lien on my inventory, something he'd arranged months ago for liquidity paperwork I had supposedly signed. The sentence arrived like a hairline crack in a drinking glass, invisible until it spreads. I felt the old training flick on inside me, the counting, the checking, the quiet cataloging of dates and signatures and names. I asked him which bank, and he said a name I hate because it rhymes with easy. He looked pleased, triumphant, even as if he'd finally named a weapon I didn't know existed. But the thing about men who think you don't read your own contracts is that they often forget you learn to read before you learn to love. His eyes fluttered when I told him to leave when I said the word forgery out loud. Not loud enough for the customers browsing silk blouses, but loud enough for the truth to stand upright between us. After he left, I sat in the stockroom among boxes that smelled like new beginnings and typed an email to my attorney. I attached scanned invoices and minutes from vendor meetings, and a copy of the authorization form that should have carried my signature but didn't. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat while I reread my words, and I let myself feel it, the tremor of fury braided with grief. To be betrayed in love is to be cracked open. To be betrayed in business is to be misunderstood on a level that makes the soul itself bristle. I pressed send and breathed long and even like a diver breaking the surface and remembering air. On my way home, I stopped at the bank whose name Gran had written on the card. The lobby smelled like pennies and carpet cleaner, and the vault door gleamed like the future no longer belonged to him. The box was small, the contents smaller, a modest fund Gran had called a rainy day parka. Not a boat, never a boat, she'd have said with a smile. But there was also a letter in her spidery hand. She wrote about my mother, about the day my father left with a note on the refrigerator, and how she had learned to hold a family together with casseroles and arithmetic. She told me she had chosen me the first time I cried in her arms, and she counted my breaths to calm me down. Counting is a way of loving, she wrote. They'll tell you you're cold for it. You'll know better. I folded the letter back on its creases and felt the long thread of our women tug through me, a lineage not of bitterness, but of clarity. That night, I changed the deadbolt and watered the plants, and made myself a bowl of pasta that tasted like exactly enough. The house hummed its familiar song, and I let it hold me. Upstairs, I slid Gran's key onto my chain next to a pendant Mark had given me years ago, when apologies still arrived with flowers. It felt right there, the old and the old new touching. I lay down and closed my eyes and pictured the ledger lines of my future, precise and generous, ready to welcome whatever I wrote on them next. The bank's fraud officer had a listening face, the kind that doesn't blink when a woman lays out paper cuts that collectively amount to a wound. She traced a fingertip along the photocopy of the lien and hummed a small, non-committal sound before asking for my driver's license. When she compared my signature to the one anchoring the lien, something in her posture settled. A notary's stamp, pressed at a slant, bloomed like a bruise in the corner. "We'll open an internal review," she said, voice low, deliberate. If the notary confirms she wasn't present, this document is void on its face. I thought of Mark saying the bank's name with that pleased, triumphant tone, the way a boy holds up a rock, certain he's found a diamond. The fraud officer took my phone number on a yellow sticky, and almost as an afterthought, asked if I'd mind emailing the screenshots of his texts. I minded, and I didn't. What I minded was the way betrayal keeps asking for more of you after it's already taken so much. Still, I sent them from my car in the parking lot, air conditioning loud in my ears, the cursor blinking like a lighthouse. By dusk, my attorney had looped in a forensic document examiner, a person I didn't know existed outside of television. She spoke like a violin clean, precise about pen pressure and line quality, about hesitation marks on forged signatures. She asked for samples of my handwriting from a range of years, and I found myself standing at Grand Secretary, sliding out recipe cards and permission slips I'd signed for school field trips. My life in cursive. I felt suddenly the tenderness of being a person whose loops and slants were proof of something true. I packed them carefully, as if they could bruise. That night, the boutique's security app woke me at 2:11 a.m., with a square of light on my ceiling and a soft chime that turned my bones to glass. Motion detected rear corridor. I could see the feed, a blur, a shoulder, a familiar slope of neck that made my stomach drop and then level. I didn't put on shoes. I didn't become a movie version of myself. I called the police and sat cross-legged on the floor in the gold spill of the bedside lamp and counted my breaths, Grand's old medicine. The officers were kind in their practiced way, two men who have seen too many people trying to hold their lives together with trembling hands. They replayed the footage, took my statement, and promised to follow up. When the door closed behind them, the house sounded like it had after storms when I was a child, emptier for the silence left behind. In the morning, a voicemail waited from the bank. The notary, a woman whose voice, even through the recording, held the weary professionalism of someone who has decided to tell the truth, no matter where it lands, stated she had never met me. The appointment on her log was marked, "Customer declined to appear, signed off-site." She had been told my consent was recorded. It wasn't. The fraud officer's second message was brisk, and bracing the lien was cancelled pending a formal report. Their compliance team would be forwarding a file to the district attorney. I set the phone down like it was a bird that might still fly away, and stood in the kitchen with my palms flat on the counter until the room stopped tilting. Not long after, his mother came by with a tin of lemon bars that tasted like the way apologies try to sweeten what can't be unsaid. She sat at my table, hands clasped, like she was holding her own wrists together. She said his name only once. After that, she said my son, and when he was little, and finally, I should have told you a long time ago. The secret she laid down between us wasn't dramatic so much as heavy. When he was 16, he watched his father sign his boss's name on a payroll check to tide us over, and nothing terrible happened. The world didn't end. Dinner was paid for. The TV stayed on. It became a private family lesson, how rules are suggestions if you smile and keep your story straight. I did not correct that lesson, she whispered. I thought I was protecting us. What I was doing was teaching him a trick that would one day leave him with nothing. She slid me a folder of photocopied receipts, small loans she'd made him from her retirement over the years, so he could keep up appearances. The numbers added to a kind of grief that didn't look like rage. It looked like pity with a sharp edge. I remembered as she spoke the day my father left the note on the fridge, curling at the edges. My mother sitting on the floor, as if the chair had moved without telling her. Gran had put water on to boil, and said as calmly as if she were reading out the weather, that we would be all right, that some storms remove what was never built to last. I had been 12 and didn't understand how she could be so sure. Now counting the women at my kitchen table, my grandmother in my chest, his mother with her hands in a chapel, myself with pen and steadiness, I understood. Certainty is sometimes a decision you make, and then keep making. The document examiner's report arrived 2 days later, an orchestra of small facts that together played one song, forgery. My signature traveled with an unnatural tremor across the lean no lift, at the points where my hand knows to breathe. The pressure was wrong, the slant a performance. My attorney filed a motion and handed me language that tasted clinical and saved me anyway: conversion fraud, injunctive relief. Meanwhile, the police called to say a detective would like to speak with me about the footage and that a warrant had been requested for questioning. Revenge wasn't a blaze, it was an orderly procession of doors opening because you had assembled the right keys. He came to the house one afternoon, eyes bloodshot, hair in the vague disarray of a man returning from an argument with the mirror. I saw for the first time the boy he must have been clever cornered, loved without boundaries that would have felt like love to him. He said my name the way people say a word they hope will open something. He told me he'd made mistakes. He told me people make mistakes. He asked how much humiliation I required before I would feel done. It would be easy here to paint myself as righteous steel, to say I didn't waver. The truth is, I felt the ache of our old tenderness, like a bruise pressed too soon. But tenderness is not permission. Mercy is not amnesia. I told him I wanted nothing he hadn't already promised to return. I told him the bank had called. I told him the notary had told the truth. I told him I hoped for his own sake that he was ready to start telling it too. He laughed, then short, emptied of swagger, and said I was colder than he'd ever imagined. I thought of Grand's letter of counting as a way of loving, and I realized he would never understand. My cold was simply heat directed inward warmth. I was no longer pouring into a sieve. When he left, his mother, who had been waiting in her car at the curb, caught my eye through the glass and lifted a hand that was both apology and blessing. I lifted mine back. The air between us felt like the thin place where grief and gratitude shake hands. That evening I walked through the boutique at closing, running my fingers along the racks, straightening hangers to their precise angle. The security camera's red light pulsed like a heartbeat. Outside, the sky went the soft color of the backs of seashells. I locked the door, checked it twice, and stood under the awning while the streetlights flickered awake. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something better aligned. The ledger was balancing. The woman I had been too patient, too hopeful, wasn't being erased, she was being amended. A neat note in the margin: correct forward. The detective's office looked like an unremarkable square gray carpet, a window that offered nothing but a slice of sky, but I will remember it as the room where the shape of my life finally made sense. He had the patient hands of someone who knows paper can outlast noise. He thanked me for the footage, for the copies of the lien, for my steadiness. He said the notary's affidavit had arrived spare and devastating, and that the bank's internal report had read like a metronome, dates, signatures, gaps, where honesty should have been. He asked me to tell the story once more, from the first text to the motion sensor's pale glow, and I did the thing Gran taught me. I counted. When I finished, he closed his notebook and said there would likely be 2 tracks, now the criminal one with its own careful gears, and the civil one already clicking forward. I walked out into late light and felt for the first time in months that gravity and grace were collaborating on my behalf. Word filtered through that charges were being considered. The district attorney's office sent a tidy letter. My attorney sent a draft of a settlement that read like the opposite of romance: return of funds, acknowledgement of forgery, relinquishment of any claim to the house. The business, the future, I was no longer interested in sharing. I signed my name where it belonged. He stalled, he blustered. He tried to bargain, as if we were splitting a check that had arrived larger than expected. In the meantime, I did something small and impossible. I slept through the night. The boutique opened each morning to the bell's shy note, and I stood in the doorway in the kind of quiet that isn't emptiness but room. On a Tuesday that smelled like rain on hot pavement, he agreed to meet at my lawyer's office. He looked thinner, as if the story he'd been telling himself had finally stopped feeding him. He didn't touch the coffee. He didn't look at me long. He read each page with a face that kept trying on new versions of itself: charm, anger, regret, like ties laid out for a meeting that had already ended. When he reached the paragraph about the notary, something in him slumped, as if a chair had been pulled away and he'd decided to sit on the floor rather than fall. He signed. The pen left a dark trail that for once belonged to the truth. The detective called the next day to say a plea was being discussed, that sometimes men who smile at rules will still pick the version of accountability that lets them keep what pride they can gather with both hands. I did not celebrate. I watered the plants and restocked the shelf of black dresses, the one women come to like a shoreline, when a tide has taken more than its share, and I wrote an idea in my notebook, a Saturday workshop at the shop an hour before opening called Count on Yourself. I would bring coffee and ledgers. I would show women how to read their statements without flinching, how to open envelopes that hum with dread, how to keep copies, how to say no to signatures they didn't write themselves. I felt a bright, steady heat move through me, not revenge, but use. If a wound doesn't teach you anything, it's only a wound. I wanted to be scarred and useful. His mother came by once more, not with desserts this time, but with a small box of her own. Mother's things, a thimble, a postcard, a coin someone had carried in a shoe during the war. She said families are just ledgers with casseroles and Christmas cards pasted over the columns, and that sometimes the numbers bleed through no matter how many lights you string. She told me she was selling her house, moving somewhere with fewer rooms and more sun. She cried without sound, and then stopped and lifted her chin, and I loved her a little for knowing how to be both tender and done. When she left, she pressed a photograph into my palm. Him at 6, gap-toothed and triumphant, with a paper crown from a burger place, and I slipped it into Gran's ledger, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder that somewhere between boy and man, a lesson had calcified, and in another house, a different lesson had survived it. The criminal case settled into its own rhythm letters with seals, dates on calendars, a courtroom where the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old promises. He took the plea, admitted what ink and cameras had already said. I watched him raise his hand and swear to tell the truth the way you watch a bridge you've already crossed. I did not ask for prison. I asked for restitution, for fees, for the acknowledgement that the boutique and the house were not trinkets he had once been kind enough to let me hold. The judge's gavel sounded like something ordinary, a cupboard closing a book shut for the night, and I felt a tiny click inside me where fear had been. When the divorce decree arrived, the envelope looked like any other bill. Inside it read, like the end of a chapter that had begun before I learned to name foreshadowing. I made pasta and ate it at the dining table Gran had polished for 3 decades, and I poured a glass of wine and took off the pendant he'd given me, the one that had started to feel like a magnet for apologies. I laid it next to the brass key on the runner. They looked like a before and after that belonged to the same person. I slept with the window cracked and the fan turning the air over like a page. The first Saturday workshop drew 5 women, then 11, then a small crowd that laughed at my bad jokes about receipts and called out the names of their own small salvations, credit unions, cousins with trucks, managers who handed over extra shifts when grief made punctuality an act of worship. We sat on folding chairs among dresses that waited like patient company, and we told the truth in numbers and names that no one else needed to hear. I didn't tell them my whole story. I didn't need to. I showed them how the math could hold what the heart couldn't yet. After a woman in a navy blazer picked up a simple black dress and said she felt like a person she wasn't embarrassed to introduce to herself, I rang her up and thought, there it is, the point. The ledger balancing not as punishment but as promise. On the anniversary of the text, I closed the shop early and drove to the beach. The water was the color of a calm decision. I stood barefoot at the line where sea keeps saying hello to land and rehearsed the numbers I would carry forward: 1 house, 1 business, 2 hands, a chain with a key, and a space where a pendant had been. I thought of Gran, of her fountain pen's neat lines. I thought of his mother, of lemon bars and lessons corrected too late. I thought of the women in my shop writing their names in full on the top of fresh pages. I forgave as much as I could without lying. I kept the rest for later. If you've listened this far, if you've carried any of this with me, the fear, the counting, the quiet reclaiming, then take a breath with me now. If it helped you, if it reminded you that clarity is a kind of love tap, Like, so this story reaches another woman in a kitchen holding a bill she's afraid to open. Share it with someone who needs proof that numbers can be merciful. Subscribe if you want more stories that tell the truth gently, and leave a light on for you. And in the comments, tell me one small way you're choosing yourself today, so another woman can count it and feel less alone.